Welcome back to part 2 of this Mixbus Mania on custom routing virtual drums. So for custom routing, I'm going to start the same way we did earlier. I'll add a MIDI track. I've got my drum plugin set up. I'll click Add and Close. And this time I'll leave the output configuration set to automatic. I'm not going to fan anything out. And I'll click Add. And you can see in the window here that the outputs are routed to 2 stereo outputs. I want to change that. The first thing that I'll do is turn off the routing to the master bus from this MIDI track so I don't hear any audio from it, because I'm going to route the audio outputs to a bunch of different tracks for those individual instruments, and I don't need any audio from this track. Now if I go to Easy Drummer on the Mixer tab, all of my outputs are still routed to the first output pair, 1 and 2. And I'm going to start with a kick. So I'm going to solo this, and then I will change the pinout connections so that only one output is coming from here into an audio track that I set up to receive it. Okay, so I'll solo the kick drum track. Let me get some audio in here. Ready to go. Now let's take a look at the pinouts on the MIDI track. So right now I have all of the tracks in Easy Drummer routed to outputs 1 and 2 here. And I have my kick drum soloed. I'm going to remove one of these because I only want my kick drum coming out one output, a mono output. I'm going to right click this second output and remove the connection. You could route both of these tracks to a stereo track in Mixbus, but I prefer to have one single mono track. You can do whatever you like best. Now what I'll do is add an audio track to receive that output. I'll call this kick. I want to keep it mono. I'll add that. And then if I go to the inputs, a default input was routed here, so I'm going to disconnect that. And then I can click on input and then routing grid and go to Mixbus tracks. Here are the 2 outs that we have so far coming from Easy Drummer. And I remove the connection from this track, so I only have audio going to this one right now. So I'm going to make this connection. I'll click that and close this. And then I have to change monitoring, so I'm monitoring the input here. So I'll click this in button. Now in Easy Drummer, when I play this clip, I've got my kick drum input coming out here. And actually, so far I still have all of these routed here. If I take this off, but I'll change that as we go along. So I've got my kick drum routed. Now I'm going to work on the snare. So I'll solo the snare, and I'll change this to output number 2, and then I'll go change my pinout connection. So back on the MIDI track, pin connections. Now since I changed that output to number 2, it's no longer going to these first stereo outputs, it's going here. So the snare is going here to outputs 3 and 4. Kick is going to 1 and 2 along with everything else. So I'm going to take this for the snare and I'll route it to the second output. That connection's made there. Now I'll add another audio track to receive that output. Call that snare. Add that. And I'll repeat the same procedure. So I'll go to my inputs, disconnect this default input, go down to the routing grid, Mixbus tracks, and kick is going here to the first output, snare is going here to the second one, so I'll make that connection for this track, and then I'll click in for monitoring. So now, when I play this snare, I should be seeing snare just on this track. And I can add the kick in. Okay, so far so good. So I'll go through this procedure for the hi-hat, which is another mono track, and then we have some stereo tracks to deal with here. So let me solo the hi-hat track. Change this to output number 3. Back to my pinout connections in the MIDI track. So this is kick, snare. Now I've got hi-hat coming to output 3, which is mapped to 5 and 6 in here because these are stereo pairs for each output. I don't have another audio out here, so I need to add one. So I'm going to click Manual Config, and then I'll Click the plus button under audio out to add another audio out. And now I can take this number 5 for my hi-hat and map it to this third output. Same drill. Add a track, label it, and click add and close. And then disconnect this default input. Go back to the routing grid, Mixbus tracks. Now you can see that the left and right output that we had earlier has changed to numbered outputs because there are more than 2. So we have kick here, snare going out here, hi-hat coming here. I'll make this connection. Change this monitoring to in for input monitoring. And then we'll test this. There's my hat on the track I wanted. I can pan that here. And here's my snare and my kick. All right. So next up, we've got some stereo tracks. You can handle those with a stereo track in Mixbus, or you can route them to separate mono tracks. I prefer separate mono tracks for things like toms and overheads. So that's how I'm going to route them. So I'll change this to output number 4. I'll solo this so I can work on it. Back to the MIDI track, pin connections. And here's our kick, snare, hi-hat. This is our toms, 7 and 8, coming from output 4 in Easy Drummer. And I'm going to route both of those to 2 separate audio outs because I want to run them stereo to 2 separate tracks. I could do this one at a time. I'm going to do them both right now since you probably got the hang of it. I'll click the button to add an output, click to add another output. Here's my 7. This is my left toms. Here's 8 for my right toms. So now I'll need 2 tracks for that. Call this toms left. Go to input, disconnect the default. Go back to the routing grid, Mixbus tracks. Now I have kick, snare, hat, toms left, toms right. So I'll route this here for the left toms, change that to in, and I'll do the same thing for the toms right. Now let me just find a pattern here that has some toms in them. Don't know that this one does. Okay, so here's a pattern with some toms in it. Probably pan those out. There we go. Go back to the mixer and play this and add some other things back. All right, so I'll do the same thing for the overheads. Send those to output 5. I'm going to need 2 more audio outs. And here were toms left and toms right. Here's my overheads left and overheads right. Add the tracks. Change the inputs. Set the monitoring. And let's hear just the overheads. add some more back in. Cool. So now the only other track I want to add in is my ambient mics. I'm not going to use the compression from the plugin. I'm not going to use the reverb from the plugin, so I don't need any of these right now because they're either not in the patterns that I plan on using or because I'd rather do the processing for things like reverb and compression within Mixbus. So last one, let's unmute these and go to the ambient mics, change this to 6. And I'll do the same thing for these, route them out stereo to 2 separate tracks. So I'll add 2 outputs. This was my overheads, the last ones I did. Here's my ambient mic left, my ambient mic right. There's the connection for the right. Change the monitoring. Let's check this. Cool. So I should now have a full kit of all the tracks that I want. The only other thing I'm going to do here is rearrange the order of these tracks because I just like them another way. So I'll just go up here to my left and right tracks. I'm going to control arrow up to move these up. Move my overheads up. Then I'll move my ambient mics up, same way. Shift click to select them both. Control arrow up to move them up. And the rest of that looks okay to me. And we'll just hear this. So that is how you do custom routing from a drum plugin in Mixbus to set up exactly the tracks you want the way that you want them. Now you can do all your panning and processing within Mixbus just as if you had recorded the drums live. Sometimes the processing in the plugin can sound great for what you're doing in the song. Other times it just doesn't sound right with what you're using in the rest of your mix in your DAW. Reverbs in particular, if you're using your drum plugin's reverb for your drums, it can sound like the rest of your instruments are in a different space than your drums are. And sometimes you like to compress your bass with your drums instead of just compressing the drums separately. So this allows you to do that and allows you to mix fully within your DAW.